You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
So we send best wishes to Charlie Watts, who's undergoing a procedure, and that
he's off games.
He's off
games for a while.
Yeah. And so the statement says, "For once, my timing was a little off." I think that statement we should thank once again Bernard Doherty. I think that surely comes from the rich imagination of Mr. B. Doherty, doesn't it? Rather than rolling off the tongue of Charlie Watts.
It's so brilliant, isn't it? It's such a funny quote.
It's perfect. I would imagine Bernard's had that sitting around in a notebook for years, waiting for just such an eventuality.
Well, it's the same as whatever it was, 5 years of playing and 20 years of hanging around. Which I think he said to you, actually.
He did.
Which sounded to me as that might have been given to him on a piece of paper just beforehand. But bless him, no, he's off games. It's a bit like, I remember Neil Tennant at Smash Hits always used to describe when people were always saying that they're back home, they got some Lucozade, they've got a jigsaw, and they're having something eggy on a tray.
Eggy on a tray, absolutely.
That may be what he's doing. But who would have believed that Keith Richards would have been the healthiest member of the Stones? Sort of has, I think, because Charlie was ill a while ago. Ronnie's been very ill recently. Jagger had the heart operation.
Yeah.
And Keith, as far as I can see, apart from having an abscess on his finger after stabbing his finger in 2015 on the end of a guitar string, again, whether we believe that or not, it might be the work of Doherty trying to cover up something else, actually. That was his only time that they had to cancel a gig, I think. So
They did. They cancelled those Wembley shows.
They did.
Postponed those Wembley shows. And so people have been asking, in the world of social media, at what point do the Rolling Stones cease becoming the Rolling Stones? If you have a ticket to see the Rolling Stones and you're not seeing Charlie Watts and the drums, you're seeing session man Steve Jordan, are you feeling slightly shortchanged? You see, I think I am.
I am. Whereas, and no disrespect to him, the new boy who's been there for whatever it is, nearly 40 years, no Ronnie Wood, I would mind less, actually. But no Charlie Watts. Oh, my Lord.
Charlie Watts is
right.
It's a kind of feature, isn't it? It's a feature of the property, isn't it, Charlie Watts? It's like turning up at the, Tower Bridge and find it's been moved or something. It's he's an original feature, isn't it, really? And you want the original features. Anyway, we wish him well, and, we hope he's back as soon as
But there's another drummer-related story. You notice that story about the guy from Offspring?
Yes.
I know, it's amazing. A guy called Pete Parada, the drummer of Offspring, and it's so interesting because he's been fired from the group, as far as I can see. I don't know if permanently or temporarily, for not having a vaccination. He's not been vaxxed. He claims he has some condition where he shouldn't be vaxxed, but they don't feel comfortable being around a guy who isn't vaxxed on the tour. So he's been booted out of the band, which is just another classic example of how the left and right wing appear to change places. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
It's amazing because the left wing used to be the kind of the anarchists. The kind
we do what we want.
Yeah, no one rubber stamps. I won't kowtow to the man and to authority. And now it's the right wing. The right wing are the ones out there, aren't they? Complaining and
It's very difficult, isn't it? Really, because it's a working environment, isn't it? Being in a band, and there are some employers who are saying if people don't get vaccinated, we don't want them back or whatever. So I suppose this is a similar case. Really,
it used to be rock musicians calling out politicians for their bad behaviour. And other way around, actually, it was politicians. It's politicians having to go at rock musicians. And now it's the other way around, isn't it?
It's completely the other way around. And the key watchword, if you go back and listen to loads of music from the late 60s, early 70s, the key watchword was freedom. Yeah. Freedom. It was the freedom mix.
You cannot take away my freedom.
It's all about freedom. Nowadays, the people chanting that are entirely on the other end of the political spectrum. It's just really interesting, challenging times, Mark.
Absolutely,
fair to say. So so there's drummers, and of course you can't. As I've frequently observed, you cannot replace drummers. You just can't be done. They're not the same group once it's got a different drummer in there. And that's certainly the case with the Rolling Stones. And certainly the case with Led Zeppelin and loads of other people.
Well, Led Zeppelin, they didn't even try, did they?
Well, not really, no. And they were right.
Apart from Live Aid.
They were right. Well, they had Phil Collins, didn't they? So that was
yeah.
Oh, yeah, they did.
They had two drummers.
Yeah, they had two quite good drummers there. So is it right that it's 55 years ago this week since I bought this record, the Beatles Revolver? Is that the case?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Oh, my picture's the wrong way round. Wow. It's never done that before.
That's odd.
Wow. Does that mean I'm reversed?
No, you look all right to me. No, it's fine. The album sleeve is correct.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Can you remember buying it?
I can. I'll tell you the story. And so it's summer 66, is it? Yeah, of course it is. And I was returning from a school trip. We went to Norway. We went to Ulvik.
God, that's pretty adventurous. Adventurous for a 66 school trip.
Yeah, they were there. It was get a bunch of kind of randy young chaps as far away from civilization as possible. Yeah. I think that was pretty much the idea. And when we
full of herring,
full of herring,
yogurt.
And we came, but we sailed back from Bergen to Newcastle, and then was a coach from Newcastle back to Wakefield. I was being dropped off at school. And as the bus went round the bull ring in the centre of Wakefield, which is the roundabout in the middle of Wakefield, you looked, and they had a shop on the bull ring, which is like many places where you bought records in those days. It wasn't a record shop. It was a kind of general confectioner, tobacconist, so forth, but had a few records at the back.
So did you know Revolver was likely to be out?
I honestly can't remember.
Because you probably didn't know then. You thought there might be an album at some stage. They might not have said what day it was going to be.
And I just saw this in the window from the coach and thought, oh, crikey, that's a Beatles LP. And so, must have gone home and then following day or something like that, put together whatever record tokens and spare cash that was around the house, and went out and bought it. And there it is, mono copy, as everybody did in those days, because nobody had a stereo. It said also available on stereo, PCS 7009. But all this business of stereo and how people listen to things in the past came up yesterday because there's been this mammoth reissue of George Harrison's "All Things Must Pass," hasn't there?
It has.
Unbelievable.
Caused all man really divided the critics, isn't it? Because I don't know. I don't know where to start on this. Because
so there's mine. There's mine, which I've had since 1970, and that was stereo. It was one of the first stereo records I got, probably. And the thing you have to bear in mind about All Things Must Pass, which may not be evident to people who weren't there at the time, it was an enormous hit. Absolutely enormous hit. My Sweet Lord was the record of the year, late 70, going into 1971. And the album off the back of it was absolutely huge. It was the biggest, I think still the biggest Beatles solo project. Even Imagine and Band on the Run and all those things were not as big as All Things Must Pass. It was absolutely huge.
And also a massive event because it was a triple album, a box set, wasn't it? That in itself seemed an incredible moment. Massive statement. But I can't help but think that people are getting a bit carried away by the fact that it's been re-released in this variety of different formats. I mean, you can now buy a version, can't you, for $1,000. Am I right? I think it's $999 buys you a wooden crate in which you get the album. I think it's eight vinyls, 5 CDs or whatever, 70 tracks, 47 of them demos. You get books, you get figurines of garden gnomes and George Harrison. You get handwritten lyrics, you get Klaus Vormann illustrations, Hindu prayer beads. I mean, it's unbelievable. I find all that stuff really exciting. Clearly, I'm not going to spend $1,000 getting it. But I think people have been carried away by the fact that this is just an enormous event. And they're talking about how it's infinitely better sounding than the original. I don't know. I mean, I've listened to quite a lot. For me, the exciting thing is all the outtakes, You get all these extras, which I think is really, listened to a lot last night. Can you believe there's more than one take of It's Johnny's Birthday? Do you remember that?
Oh, joy.
It's a kind of throwaway number, but no, they did several takes of it, you know. There's a version of Wedding Bells Are Breaking Up That Old Gang of Mine, which is really, really funny, just them goofing about in the studio. The songs that you've never heard before, Cosmic Empire, not particularly good, actually. Lots and lots of outtakes, rather lumping outtakes of things like Wah Wah. Nothing quite like the amazing version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, which I remember vividly from the anthology things. But what did you think of the sound? Because that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, did it sound wildly different to you?
I mean, what I think is I've had this record 50 years, more than 50 years. And at no stage in those more than 50 years have I ever thought, do you know, if only they remixed this, if only they brought the vocal up a bit or took that down a bit or a little bit less echo or whatever. Never has it ever occurred to me. And so on one hand, you know, what I think about it is neither here nor there, because on one hand, I have 50 years acquaintance with this thing, right? And on the other hand, I've got 1 day's whisking through some kind of remix of it or something, you know. And so what's it going to do? Is it going to supplant the other one? And well, not in my memory or my lifetime, you know, because what is competing with is 50 years of listening to something. That's the interesting thing to me. And I think after a time, I don't know who I suppose they're doing it for a new audience. I suppose that's what they're doing. You know, they're saying, well, we don't care about old timers who bought it back then and have been listening to it for years. This is a new thing. This is for people who are, you know, born in 1980 or something like that. I don't know. And I just think it's really interesting because it seems to be the way things are going to go in the future. I mean, a lot of it is to do with the fact that it's a streaming world at the moment. And so, you know, when Taylor Swift redid a load of her stuff, half the thinking behind that was get it on streaming services. So your stuff eventually overtakes the stuff that you don't own the full rights to. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
So the new version goes on top of the old version and eventually buries the old version. And then what happens is, again, another 10 years' time, somebody comes along and does another one or something that does the same thing. Because it's not like, you know, in the days of physical product, you went in a shop and you said, all right, show me George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. They passed you it, you put it in your hand. Nowadays, it's not. It's a license to sell things called George Harrison's All Things Must Pass.
Well, precisely. I mean, it's just if you remix something, and I think this has been remixed. I think it's the third time it's been remixed, actually. I think there's one in 2009. I think there's one in 2012. But I mean, it's just a way of ensuring that people have to go back and re-listen to it in order to hear what you've done. That's just a way of getting people's attention and hopefully getting their money, isn't it? But I mean, the people complaining must be the people who've got the original and just simply don't want it changed. And just
I'm not complaining.
And complain about the principle of changing it.
I'm not complaining. You know,
so what do you think about things like the Beatles remastered? Because the remastered Beatles is infinitely clearer. And you can hear all the separation. You can hear precisely all the different instruments. But then the kind of mono Beatles is that wonderful, you know, everything welded together into a great big slab of sound, which is very, very attractive. And that's how we first heard it.
Yeah, that's how everybody heard it.
Yeah.
By the Sgt. Pepper is, you know, the classic case. People have heard it in mono because people didn't have stereos. You know, there are very few people who would have heard that in stereo. And nobody at the time listened to it and thought, well, if only it was in stereo. You know, and of course stereo, and then when stuff started appearing in stereo, it was very kind of ham-fisted, you know, reprocessed stereo, wasn't it? Where all
it was. Your bass and drums on one side, guitar and keyboards the other, vocal in the middle. I know,
very unsatisfactory, you know. And I mean, I suppose, you know, I would still listen to that in mono, you know, whereas it started to change around that time, you know, so. You wouldn't listen to the White Album in mono, would you? And that was only a year later, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
In 1968. So
yeah,
that's the That's the kind of changing point, isn't it, really? Did the White Album come out in mono? I suppose it must have.
Yeah, it did. I'm sure
Did it? Oh, well,
or were there two different versions?
I don't.
But I can't tell with this thing. I listened to quite a bit last night, and the vocal is a bit higher in the mix, isn't it? And some of the brass is kind of punched up, and there's the odd slide guitar you didn't notice before. But it's not. It doesn't seem wildly different to me. And who cares?
I'll tell you who cares. I'll tell you one person who cares. Do you watch those clips of Bobby Whitlock?
Oh, it's Bobby Whitlock. I saw that. Yeah, Bobby Whitlock, who played the keyboard and the piano on it, and he's absolutely incensed. I
do recommend people should seek out the YouTube channel of Bobby Whitlock. Bobby Whitlock, member of Delaney and Barney's band, singer, keyboard player, organist. And then
Derek and the Dominoes.
And so sang Layla, all that kind of stuff. And, he's still around. And he's with his wife partner, who's clearly very shrewd in keeping his profile out there. So this is what Bobby Whitlock does. Because I've watched a load of Bobby Whitlock videos, and they're all kind of really interesting.
Oh, does he do that? That's the first one I'd seen. So is he constantly firing off?
Mark, he does hundreds. Okay,
right.
Everybody he's ever worked with, he'll just think about it, reminisce about.
Yeah.
And she'll film him and she'll interview him or whatever. And two things are always you've got to look out for. Whenever he does a new one, he's always wearing a different shirt. So I'm sorry, she has clearly said to him, being, his
she's the costumier, she's the director,
she's everything.
Hair and makeup. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
He looks brilliantly well preserved, actually.
Absolutely, he does really well.
Right, he looks fabulous.
So she always says, no, put a different shirt on. No, you've worn that one before or whatever.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, it's always done in a slightly different angle of a slightly different corner of their quite nice home. It's in the kitchen.
So what does he talk about? Because he's
about everything. Everybody he's worked with, and he's worked with a load. So he'll talk about Eric Clapton, or he'll talk about Leon Russell, or he'll talk about Delaney and Bonnie, and all sorts of people. And, he does have a very good memory. And so anyway, his thing about all things must pass, he couldn't restrain himself yesterday. He said it was the worst thing he'd ever heard in his life. I don't think it's that bad at all, But
it's unbelievably outspoken. It's worth watching, isn't it? He thinks it's a travesty.
He does.
They've wrecked it,
yes.
And it's muddy and it's appalling. And
but he must. Fair enough. He remembers being there, and he does remember being there. You can tell.
Yeah.
He says, I was there at every single session. I was there, even there at the sessions that I didn't play on, because I wanted to be there at absolutely every single session. And so I believe him in that. So it's very, very much worth watching. Let's see if he changes his mind in due course.
So where will the remixes end? The Godfather. Will the Godfather come back?
Well, there you see, that's
audible.
Yeah. You see, do I want to hear The Godfather in such a way that I can hear absolutely every bit of dialogue? I'm not sure I do, really.
No, you don't. The thing about The Godfather was it was real. It was real conversation. You kind of had to lean in as if you were eavesdropping. You couldn't quite hear what they were saying.
The murk is part of the appeal of these things.
It is. It's like The Irishman. You need subtitles to understand what the hell's going on.
But it's like all things must pass. But take away the spectrized echo. Well, they wouldn't be doing that if Spectre was A, still alive, and B, not disgraced. Yeah. Nobody would be doing this if this were, I don't know who, Dozier Holland or whatever.
Yeah.
They would not dare. They only dare because A is disgraced, B is dead. And so they can say...
the two main characters can't complain about
absolutely.
it. I know.
Anyway, we shall see.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
Well, as it was his 120th birthday 3 or 4 days ago, I was reminded of the life story of Louis Armstrong. And my question to you, Dave, is, did any musician ever have a tougher start to life than Louis Armstrong? It's incredible. Nile Rodgers, do you remember we interviewed him once on a podcast?
Yeah.
Nile Rodgers, mum was 13 when she got pregnant with him. She was just 14 when he was born, brought up in a brothel, Thelonious Monk coming around, various other junkies to score. I mean, a really difficult life. 50 Cent, mum was a drug dealer who died in a mysterious fire when he was 8. His father left, brought up by his grandparents when he was 12. He became a dealer. Dolly Parton, Ringo Starr, Rihanna. I mean, they had really, really tough lives. But Louis Armstrong, seriously. I mean, firstly, his mother told him inexplicably that he was born on the 4th of July, 1900. Actually, he was born on the 4th of August, 1901. So, I mean, I know it's not a big deal, but he grew up thinking that he was a year older than he actually was. So when he was 6 at school, probably struggling slightly, he was actually only 4. His mum had him when she was 16. She was a prostitute.
No, sorry, interrupt. 15.
Oh, 15. Was it 15?
15.
Okay, 15. So his mum, a prostitute. Dad left soon after. He was brought up briefly by his grandparents, returned to living with his mum. At the age of 7, was rescued by a Lithuanian Jewish family who thought his life was so terrible that they kind of took him on. And these people made their money selling coal to brothels in New Orleans. So no parents, no siblings, incredible poverty. When he was 11, caught firing a gun and sent to the Coloured Waifs Home for Boys, which effectively, I think, was kind of junior Borstal, wasn't it? Where he spent 18 months, no mattresses on the beds, meals, mostly bread and molasses. Got out, sang on street corners for spare change. Around 13, he started hearing jazz in being played in brothels in Storyville, started playing in a band, started smoking weed. At the age of 15, he pimped for a prostitute called Nootsie, and they fell out after she stabbed him in the shoulder. I know. His mum took him out to bars and taught him how to drink. One biographer said he smoked 3 cigar-sized joints a day, which would have contributed to his later lung problems. He then married a prostitute called Daisy, the first of his 4 wives, when he was 17. Worked in various bands run by mobsters and gangsters. Got a job with King Oliver's Creole band when he was 21, married the pianist, and then recorded a song called Muggles, which of course was slang for marijuana, was caught smoking weed. In fact, a rival band leader called the police and shopped him because he was outside the Cotton Club in LA smoking weed in the car park. Got a 30-day jail sentence. I mean, and then, he gets into Louis Armstrong and his Stompers, and he has the vocal hit with the version of Ain't Misbehaving by Fats Waller, and, and it leads to High Society and Hello Dolly, and becomes the kind of showbiz figure that we remember. But don't you think that's an amazing story? And how much of that would have been known at the time? They would have known about his poverty.
Well, no, he was because he wrote about this in his autobiography in the 50s when he was the America's sweetheart kind of thing, and he was quite forthright about it, and he never complained about any of it. Because he was immensely positive. But
was he talking about the poverty? Was he talking about all the drugs?
I don't know about the drugs, but certainly the violence, the poverty, and so forth, and the fact that his mother was at that stage was on the game, and his first wife was as well. But the interesting thing is, like you say, he shot the pistol in the street in New Orleans, and was up before the Beak, who instantly sent him to the New Orleans Home for Coloured Waifs, which he thinks was the best day's work ever done for him.
Well, that's because he learned to play the cornet, didn't he?
They had a band. They had a really good band, and they didn't just they played formal stuff. They learned to read music and so forth as well as playing kind of dance music or whatever. And when he was kind of discharged, they said he could go home. He didn't really want to go home because he was quite happy. And, all Louis ever in his life, all he ever wanted to do was play, just carry on playing.
Yeah.
And I was just looking at this biography, Terry Teachout book about Louis Armstrong, that just my eye fell upon the page where he has his arrangement with Joe Glaser, who was his manager throughout most of his career. And the proposition Armstrong made to Glaser was straightforward. I think it's really interesting. It tells you so much about musicians. It says, you get me the jobs, you collect the money, you pay me $1,000 every week, free and clear, and then you pay off the band, the travel, the hotel expenses, my income tax, and then you can take everything that's left. He didn't care if Joe Glazer made far more than $1,000 a week. It didn't bother him at all. He just wanted $1,000 a week because he thought that's kind of living. You know, I can do what I want to do, and then I want to
but
not
security,
have to worry about anything else at all. And I think, you know, it's we're soon next week we're going to be talking to Eamon Ford about his book Leaving the Building, which is about kind of rock and roll estates, and you know, and I suppose this all ties in with our conversation about George Harrison, all things Smith House. You know, the afterlife of musicians, and so much of the time they don't want to think about the long range at all. They just want to think about the next gig. You know, can you pay me enough money to get me through the week? That's all.
But also, somebody coming from Louis Armstrong's background would just want that security, wouldn't they? That's the important thing. They just want to know that for the foreseeable future, everything's going to be fine.
But it's the idea that he didn't care if the manager made far more money than he did. He just didn't care, as long as they get $1,000 a week.
Yeah.
After a while, they changed it to a 50-50 split. But Glazer went on paying Louis Armstrong's income tax and his expenses till the day he died, pretty much, so that Louis didn't have to think about it. And it's very often the way that musicians get into problems because they just don't want to think about that stuff at all.
Yeah.
But those things don't go away. You know, they come back eventually.
We were having that really interesting conversation just a few days ago with Tot Taylor, weren't we?
Oh, God.
We did a Word in Your Attic with him. A really interesting guy, and he used to be in a group called, really, really interesting. He was in a group called Advertising in 1978, and then went on to form the Compact organisation, wrote all the hits for Mary Wilson, and has since been in some really, really high-ranking and fascinating jobs, hasn't he? Film and soundtracks, work for John Landis, and working with McCartney and Michael Stipe and stuff. And he told that incredible story. Just so interesting how the music industry has changed. He's talking about when he was at school, and this was, I think, in either 72 or 73.
Yeah.
And he'd been watching either Colour Me Pop or Old Grey Whistle, probably would have been Old Grey Whistle Test. And the presenter was Richard Williams. And he had a band, didn't he? And he thought, I need to get in touch with that guy. That guy seems to know what he's talking about. And, you know, maybe he might write something about our group. He then wrote, he wrote to the BBC and said, how do I get in touch with Richard Williams? And eventually he got a letter back saying, he doesn't work here anymore. He works at Island Records. So he went with his mates from school, with the band, dressed in white suits, didn't they, to Island Records in St. Peter's Square, banged on the door and said, could they see Richard Williams? They said, well, have you got an appointment? They said, no. And so they sat around in reception. Eventually Richard Williams walked down the stairway. And they stopped him and said, hi, look, we're a band, and we bought you a cassette. Richard Williams amazingly took them upstairs, played the cassette in front of them, which is amazing in itself, because you wouldn't want to do that, would you, normally? No. You wouldn't want them to see your reaction if you didn't like it. Played the cassette, said, look, I like this, and let me take your details, and someone will get in touch. And when they got home, someone had rung from Island Records to organise them coming around, sorting out a recording contract, and then they went back, didn't they? They recorded an album. The
detail I don't know if they recorded something. The detail I loved was that when Tot got home, his mother was rather cross because he obviously hadn't been to school or whatever, and she said, "Never mind all that. Who do you know in Ireland?"
In Ireland. It's right. Somebody from Ireland rang.
Record company had rung, and she thought that's somebody in Ireland. But no, it wasn't. It was the beginning. But they got it. They ended up. It's honestly, you got to listen to this thing. We haven't put it up yet, but it's one of the most colourful and illuminating chats that we've had in all our Word in Your Attic conversations over the last year and a half.
It just gave you so much insight into just how freewheeling the music industry was. If you ran into the right person,
it's also
they up living in a flat, don't they, with Black Uhuru.
But also it's the fact that he didn't know what is really interesting. His equivalent nowadays would know.
Yeah.
Would have spent days on the internet working out who they needed to see and what they could expect. In 1973, it was possible to be really talented in music and have no idea of that stuff. Absolutely no concept of how you got on the radio or the telly or got a deal or whatever. people weren't thinking about, subsequent to 1973, you get that whole kind of Peel show culture, don't you? Where everybody knows how to start a band. And everybody knows how, what you have to do, and you make a record and you produce it yourself, and then you send it to John Peel, and you get a session, and then maybe you get something else. They knew every rung on the ladder subsequently. In 1973, they didn't.
Not at all. His naivety is absolutely incredible. The idea he didn't realize you needed an appointment to see somebody when he went to record it. And then when they go in and record, the producer keeps saying, "Can you do that bit again?" He said, "Well, but I've done it. I mean, it was so fun." No, I want it done again. Why? Why do you want to do it again? It's just unbelievable naivety. I mean, I thought it was fantastic, and his life story was extraordinary. It was hearing.
Absolutely, that'll be up sometime in the next week. Look out for it. And again, it bears repeating. If you follow any of these things, if you listen to the podcast or whatever, please leave a comment on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you do these things, because it does make a difference. And also, if you follow the YouTube channel, which I'm sure many people do make sure you're subscribed to that channel, because that again makes a big difference. And the thing that really makes a difference is if you really want to help us in our very important work, you can become a supporter on Patreon. You go to patreon.com/word in your ear and find out how to do that. We'd very much appreciate that. We'll be back with Any Other Business.
This is a junction in the Word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
So I've been listening to a podcast about the kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. Are we all familiar with this, Alex? A bit before your time, I would imagine. Probably even a bit.
I've heard it, and it's an absolutely brilliant story. We should recap. Go on.
1963, extraordinarily, between the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the arrival of the Beatles in February 1964, one further huge news event happens in the United States. Frank Sinatra Jr., 19-year-old singer, is kidnapped in, I think, Reno, Nevada.
Lake Tahoe, wasn't it?
Lake Tahoe.
Yeah.
And it disappears for 2 days, I think. And, there are ransom demands that go to Frank Sinatra and so forth. They're absolutely huge story over here. The amazing thing is, the reason why this podcast is really worth hearing is the guy who did it is still with us, which is extraordinary. Pretty much all the protagonists in the story are no longer with us. Frank Sinatra Jr. is no longer with us. Obviously, Frank Sinatra is no longer with us. But the guy who did it is. And he did it to raise money to get over a short-term liquidity problem.
Yeah, he'd become addicted to painkillers after a car crash or something, a back injury, and he just bankrupted himself. So I need $240,000.
What shall I do? How shall I get that? I know. I'll kidnap somebody. Who's list of people. He was advised not to kidnap a woman because don't kidnap a child, because it's too. That's too much scandal and so.
And he got his mate from school and his mum's former boyfriend was his gang, wasn't it?
But the amazing thing about this, I go and listen to it. It's really good. But the thing I never realised was the involvement in the story of Jan and Dean, surf duo. Did you catch this bit?
No, I don't think I did. No, go on.
Okay, so Dean Torrance, who was one member of Jan and Dean, who is Surf City and all those things, Dead Man's Curve and so forth, was a very successful pop star at the time, really successful, and the kidnapper had been to school with him. Okay. And so he borrowed some money off him to finance, unknowingly, innocently on Dean Torrance's part, to finance this operation. And what it's all about rabbit holes, the internet, so the rabbit hole I disappeared down was finding out more about the school that the two of them went to, which was University High in Hollywood, okay? And University High has a somewhat stellar list of former pupils, okay? And I'm just going to run through them as if there's a school register. We're going to take the register, okay? And so you can answer your names on behalf of these legendary figures. who went to University High. Okay, are you ready? Funicello, Annette.
Yes, sir.
Cassidy, David.
Yep.
Densmore, John.
Certainly am.
Fowley, Kim.
Yes, Mr. Hepworth.
Garland, Judy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Gordon, Kim.
Here.
Krieger, Robbie.
So, here. I'm sorry I was a bit late, but I'm here.
McKee, Maria.
Yes, sir.
Monroe, Marilyn.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
Newman, Randy.
Yes, sir.
Sinatra, Nancy.
Of course. Absolutely.
And finally, Taylor, Elizabeth.
Wow.
All went to University High. Isn't that absolutely extraordinary?
That's amazing.
Because obviously what happened was that anybody who's in Hollywood, a kind of starlet, they had to have somewhere they were supposed to go to school. They obviously never did. They were making movies or making records or whatever. But they were on the rolls of University High. That's the case.
That was the showbiz school, wasn't it?
It was
amazing. There was one amazing detail about Frank, going back to that case, that the kidnapper, Barry Keenan, would only communicate with Frank Sinatra Sr. via payphone,
yes.
And it was really rather sweet. And Frank became so concerned that he'd never have enough coins, that he always carried 10 dimes with him at all times for the rest of his life. And he was even buried with 10 dimes in his pocket. Isn't that extraordinary? As a legacy from that story.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic case.
It's an extraordinary story.
So bumbling and amateurish,
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. So I was asking if there were people out there had questions, that we often do this on the podcast, see if anybody's got questions they want to put to us. Somebody was asking, actually, we may as well answer it here. Blue Mountain wants to know, what happened to the Miles Copeland podcast?
Well, should we tell the honest truth?
The honest truth.
I think we should, which is that we set up the Miles Copeland podcast.
And he was in Los Angeles at the time. So it was obviously unusual times of day and so forth. And we set it up. Listen, most of these things we set up are set up, and I'm not going to diss anybody here. Most of them we do them ourselves. We directly contact the person and say, "Do you want to do this?" It's
just a lot easier.
It's simpler. When you get intermediaries and you get more than one intermediary, sort of things can go wrong. And as soon as you go overseas, you tend to have more than one intermediary anyway. And so the first hookup that we had with Miles Copeland, ready to record a Word in Your Attic, which is done via Zoom. He was just on a phone, wasn't he, Mark? I think he was on a phone. He was out in the streets or something. He said he didn't understand it was video.
Didn't know it was video. Didn't understand supposedly what was going on. Although I think his PR had told him, Dave.
I think probably
in some detail, but it was kind of like, really, what, So we set up another one, didn't we?
Which was when he was going to be in France, so it was easier, time of day, line up and all that sort of thing. And there we were again. There we were again, all set. Not there at all this time.
Waited about, what, 3/4 of an hour?
Probably something
waiting
like
for him to try to get hold of him.
And then they were terribly apologetic and said, do you want to set up another one? And we eventually decided, actually, this is never going to happen.
Well, it took 4 days for him to get back to his PR to respond to the fact. I mean, it's 4 days to get back to his own PR. This is never going to come off, which is a shame because actually,
it's a shame. It's a really interesting book.
Really good.
It is, but it was just our experience tells us that after you've tried and tried a few times, it's really not worth the trouble. Things are either going to happen or they're not going to happen.
And I wondered if that happened more than once because there wasn't much coverage of it, actually. I didn't see very many reviews. It's a really good book, but he may have just not quite got on board with the promotion.
Yeah,
it was good.
Yeah. So, okay, other questions. Thinking about Darren Leasley says, thinking about Tom Daly's knitting. Not very rock and roll leisure activities. Can we think of any? Ron Wood, it says Ron Wood's painting. Well, that's fairly, all sorts of musicians paint, don't they? Alice Cooper, golf. REM were big on golf, weren't they? I think they played
REM once organised an entire press campaign in Southern Ireland, I think, over the fact they could stay at a castle that had a huge golf course. I can remember at the time thinking, that's not very rock and roll. But there must be somebody who crochets or something, mustn't there?
Can I nominate
watercolours?
Rod Stewart and his train sets.
His train set? Very good.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
That's a very good one. All right, Stuart Robin wants to know, what's the band that started with the least amount of members and ended with the most, and vice versa, he says. While you're thinking about that, I have one answer, which I don't know is definitive, but it always strikes me as interesting that The Who, at the height of their powers, had only 4 members, whereas nowadays, if you went to see The Who, I think you'd see musicians as far as the eye can see. But that seems to apply to most bands who can afford it nowadays, have tons and tons of musicians on stage, don't they?
The Who these days, they have about 6 or 7 members, don't they? They've got 2 keyboard players. I think Simon Townsend is playing guitar alongside Pete Townsend. They're a small orchestra.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew
Dan, would there have been? I don't know.
Well, Steely Dan don't really count. Well, he was there because they started out as 4 or 5 of them, didn't they? Really, and then they went.
I suppose they were a band, weren't they?
Yeah. So it's a slightly different case. Andrew Mail says, given the amount of photos taken of the Beatles, could you assemble a pic for every day from 1962 to 70? It would be very expensive to produce, coffee table book, but it'd be good, wouldn't it? I suppose the difficulty with that is being definitive about which day it is. Yeah, I mean, you could be roughly around there, couldn't you? You could probably work it out to weeks and months, but working out whether the picture was taken on the Tuesday or the Thursday
sounds like a job for Mark Lewison.
It's a Mark Lewison job. My God.
They were
pretty much photographed. They were so visible and pretty much photographed every day. Every day at Abbey Road, there'd always be somebody waiting outside. Loads of people.
And to be fair, Mark Lewison doesn't need another job, does he? If ever there was a man, we can all agree he doesn't need another job. He's got a job to do. Roger Cartwright wants to know what the hell happened to Wishbone Ash. Do you know the answer to this, Mark Allen? Doesn't one of them?
Am I the world Wishbone Ash expert? I probably am, having seen them in Bracknell Sports Centre in whatever it was, 1972 or something, 70. I got a feeling that Wishbone Ash are sort of still going as Martin Turner's Wishbone Ash. I think they still exist, and God bless them.
We could have talked about that some more to Miles Copeland because, of course, he was the original manager
and learned a lot about
it. And what's happening in the next week? We've recorded further Word in Your Attic, as we say. Tot Taylor, that'll be coming up soon. Make sure you look out for that. We're recording chats with Eamon Ford very soon about his extraordinary upcoming book, Leaving the Building. Have we anything further to add before I go on my holiday? So I'm packing my bucket and spade, looking out at the driving rain outside. And
you're going to the seaside, aren't you, Dave?
I'm going to the seaside. Yes.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.